Righty. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to come and speak. Now, I was catching up with your CEO just before, and he told me that there's a bit of a challenge within the conference proceedings to make lots of references to 80s tracks. I'm not one for comedy, but because I'm just a stubborn girl from Mosgiel, I thought, well, I would still rise to the challenge a little bit, not to be outdone by Oliver Hartwich of the New Zealand Initiative. So I thought today I'm going to make a few reflections about the economy, because we're living on a prayer, talk about some of the government's ambition, sweet dreams are made of this, and just package up a bit of advice for you as a material girl. No, I'm not going to talk about that, but I just couldn't resist. Look, you've got a great topic for your conference, Transforming for Tomorrow, because I think we all know as business people there's not much we can do about history, there's not much we can do about today, but as we plan as businesses for tomorrow, that's when we can make change. And that's where advocacy comes to the fore. I don't mind the old-fashioned word lobbying either. Advocacy is a very powerful word, and it's one with deep history because, as many of you may already know, there have been advocates who have been hanging out in the lobbies of parliaments for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the 1700s, it used to be that merchants and business people would hang around trying to catch members of parliament as they would walk in and out of respective parliaments to share views, to influence, and to try and get change. And the role that we have as business advocates hasn't really changed since that time. It is our role to provide evidence, to provide expertise, and to share the views of business. So today in my 20 minutes, in my lightning talk, I'd like to do 5 things. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the role of Business New Zealand, the voice of business, our current advocacy priorities. I'd like to give you some reflections on where I think the government is progressing or not. And I'd like to tell you a bit about a review that I'm doing of some of Business New Zealand's policy positions, particularly with regard to health insurance, which I'm going to invite the Financial Services Council to assist us with. And finally, I'm going to finish with some optimism and a bit of a challenge, because as delegates to the council, to this conference, at the very end, I'm going to challenge you and invite you to get further into your advocacy and policy work, to invite each and every one of you to get in touch with your inner lobbyist, because participation in industry associations is so important. But it's the advocacy you do as individuals in your business and the conversations that you have that contributes to getting some progress on some of the problems you know we have as a country. But first, the role of Business New Zealand. Our role is to be the voice of business. Now, we have a network right up and down the country. We represent about 70,000 businesses. The network includes the EMA here in Auckland, Business Central, right down the country. And we've got a number of different groups within the Business New Zealand family, from Export New Zealand for exporters and traders, the Major Companies Group for the bigger end of town, those chief executives and corporate affairs folk who are interested in getting stuck into advocacy. We've got the Business New Zealand Energy Council, we've got the Sustainable Business Council, which many of you are involved in, and Buy New Zealand Made. So lots of different ways to interact and to get involved, and that's really important. They don't always agree or all of the time, but there are lots and lots of ways to engage. Which reminds me that I forgot to do something that was very important at the very beginning of my speech, to acknowledge Kirk Hope and his leadership of Business New Zealand. As you probably know, he's often referred to as the Rick Astley of advocacy. He's not. But I want to pay tribute to the work that he has done. I was a member of Business New Zealand for 14 years. and particularly his work that he did to advocate on behalf of all of us through COVID. I'm so grateful for the team that he left behind and the assistance that he gave to me when I took over. I really feel very strongly about his leadership being a huge contribution to the success of the organisation. But back to Business New Zealand, what are our current priorities right now? Well, there are two different time horizons that we approach business issues right now. We've got the long-term horizon, where Business New Zealand is looking right out 10, 20, 30 years, and a piece of work that Kirk actually kicked off under his leadership called Future Vision. And what we're looking at and working on with our big team of economists and policy people are the megatrends that are affecting our country. None of these will be new to you, but looking at the issues of climate change, of course, looking at an issue that's very dear to your hearts, the ageing population, and how do we deal with that? How does our economy deal with the greater number of New Zealanders who are getting older, living longer, and have variable levels of retirement savings? How do we deal with an education system that hasn't been fulfilling its promise recently? And how do we deal with an infrastructure pipeline which has been pretty empty for quite some time? Many of you know that the infrastructure that we're currently sweating right now and relying on was stuff that was built when many of us were kids and we haven't replaced it. How do we deal with these big issues facing our country, and how do we turn our members' attention to getting involved to sorting those out? The second horizon is the short to medium term, stuff that I think that the team can deliver within 12 months to 24 months. And this is where I've been getting into a bit of creativity with the Business New Zealand team. And I suspect that when I started, they were very polite with me, but they thought, oh, we don't usually do that kind of stuff. No, some of your ideas are a bit crazy. But I looked to our affiliated industry group, which is our group of 80 different business associations. And because I'd been a member, I knew it was a powerhouse for good ideas and great lobbying opportunities. So I started off pretty small, and I rang up the Hairdressers Association because I knew for nearly 40 years they'd been dealing with stupid rules about opening a salon, not being able to serve cups of tea. And I said, why don't we give this a crack? Why don't you let Business New Zealand lift and amplify your issue and put it on the agenda? Of course, people were quite entertained by the idea that the mighty Business New Zealand might get alongside the hairdressers. But I've always maintained that when we talk about cutting red tape, that in itself is a metaphor. You only cut red tape when you get into the detail. So the rest is history. That took all of about an afternoon. The hairdressers' stupid rules were repealed, and a sector which is a $1.5 billion sector was ready to go and move more quickly. Went to the Business and Events Association. They said, look, for 20 years now, we've been trying to attract high-level medical conferences to New Zealand, but New Zealand's the only country in the world that deems trade shows and expos as being advertising, so therefore it's a prohibited activity. So we can't bring them here because it wrecks the economics of our conference. So if it's the global conference for oncologists or nurses, they're on a global circuit, they bounce down through the countries. They want to come here, but they found they couldn't just because they're not allowed to talk about or display drugs that weren't registered. That was another opportunity. Nick Leggett, who many of you know is a powerhouse advocate for infrastructure in New Zealand, we said, well, is there something there we can contribute? And he said, just start talking about one thing. Help us try and get the government thinking about a bipartisan approach to work with the opposition parties so that there's not this constant flip-flopping which costs us billions of dollars. So in that instance, we just added our voice to the agenda of the industry association. We've done that quite successfully already, and it's one of the areas, one of the truths, I think, that's always been very clear to me. In Wellington, where the regulations are made, sometimes you can get success with just one voice, but mostly we get success by being a business choir and amplifying each other's messages and just getting in the ear and saying the same sort of thing. And I've got an idea to work with the Financial Services Council, and I've spoken about this with Kirk, and I'm going to mention that towards the end of my talk today. Reflections on the government's progress. Look, Business New Zealand has always been at the heart of government advice and opposition advice. So we have been in there very closely trying to assist the government to contribute to their economic growth agenda. And I can say that I do know that they are pulling every single economic lever they possibly can. Just look at the changes in investment, into immigration for skills, the education system, many of the regulatory reform issues that I've mentioned. The problem is, and it's always a political issue, that there's such a long lead time for so many of these policy changes. But I would say that, and certainly with Nicola Willis's economic growth agenda, we've been in there with our members to provide at least 30 different policy ideas that they can implement immediately. That's where the change to the government procurement rules came from, is just one example. And trying to be both a trusted advisor, but an organisation where we can collect up all the ideas of our members, and some of those have come through your organisation as well, and reflect them back and say, why don't we think differently? Why don't we do things? Why don't we just be bolder with some of the ideas? It's time for change. Now that leads me to a sacred cow within the Business New Zealand community, and that's policy community, and that's the discussion about health insurance with regard to fringe benefit tax. And as I want to do sometimes when I face a conundrum, I consult the oracle. So in this case, I went and had a chat with Kirk, and I said, why has it always been the position of Business New Zealand that we're opposed to carving out the contribution of an employer for health insurance or whatever it might be from FBT? So we had a discussion and went and asked the team, and I couldn't really hear any major compelling reasons why we wouldn't test that and start listening more to the Financial Services Council and start testing that, start thinking about changing our minds on that. Because when FBT was first brought in 1985, it was a different world there. I mean, we've been giving 80s music references right through your conference, I know, but it was different. The health system was different. Employment was different. Today we've got a health system that is struggling. Just last week, ACC came out, and some ACC figures came out that said that workers are spending twice the amount of time recovering and getting treatment for a workplace injury today than they were a decade ago. There are parts of our system that are struggling. So why not? Why shouldn't Business New Zealand be part of a discussion about how we can help employers start to contribute greater support for employees through health insurance, whatever it might be? So I really look forward to continuing that discussion with your organisation, because I want a good briefing. I want to be able to test that and go back to the team and say, why don't we think differently? These are challenging times. The other thing I would say that it is a time it's very clear to me that the government is still, even though they've been in a while, they're still very much in listening mode. They're still looking for those ideas where they can contribute, where they can then affect positive, greater growth. So it is the time, as I know you're in there engaging and providing a lot of ideas, but in the wider advocacy community, I think some organisations are not taking all those opportunities to not just go in with the complaints, but to package things up into neat solutions. But I think in your area, look, it's ripe for change in some areas. Look, I was actually quite delighted to see Winston Peters start looking about a long-term vision for super and KiwiSaver, and we've got to keep having those discussions. We know that, and I know from the research on that you've conducted, we know there are issues. They've got part of the community that have been lulled into a false sense of security that they've been paying a certain amount into KiwiSaver, that somehow prepares them for retirement. And I think more and more of us know that that's not the case. We have to be able to have some of those bold discussions and to get that bipartisan support so that there isn't flip-flopping and doesn't become a political football into the election. And you're leading that. I mean, the advocacy of this organisation is certainly best in class, and you know that with your team. Look, finally, I'd like to finish with just a bit of optimism, because when I'm asked about how the economy is going, I have to say it's mixed. No one ever wants to hear from a business advocate who is a great prophet of doom. It is our job as advocates to deliver some hope, and to particularly to say to small and medium-sized business, just hang on in there. 2026, based on the economic data Business New Zealand collects, it's looking better, and we're feeling optimistic. That said, you can't play the Pollyanna game. And while we have some members who are doing extremely well, you've got to empathise and reflect that there's so much of the current New Zealand community in business who are doing it incredibly tough. But I would also say that some of those liquidations that we are seeing can still be sheeted home to the economic carnage that business did face as a result of COVID, where they used up their nest egg or their bit of a buffer, so that when the next thing came along, they just didn't have that resilience. But I think ultimately as advocates, all of us need to remind ourselves how wonderful it is to live in this country. We have some business challenges. We all have aspirations of how we can do things better. But overall, to be here, to be able to flourish and work in this environment, I mean, we're still amongst some of the luckiest citizens in the world. That's why I would say, as my final comment to you, and I mean it when I say it's time for every single citizen, every single member of your council, business, member of society, to get in touch with your own inner lobbyist and advocate, because it's a time we're leaning into these organisations and getting more involved and putting up more ideas, and being part of that bold discussion is so important. We know we're facing some challenges, but I think if we keep working through the regulatory reform process, which hopefully undoes how makes it easier to do business here in New Zealand. Let's face it, over a period of years, we've made it quite hard to do business in some areas. We've come up, as New Zealanders want to do sometimes, against bespoke rules where New Zealand likes to do things differently. We've got to start thinking like an international, the international city that we are, to get rid of the bespoke rules, to work through the regulatory reform, to encourage all of our political thinkers to be bipartisan where they can. They do it on trade. They're currently looking like they're going to do it on infrastructure. They can do it in some of your areas, be it superannuation, KiwiSaver, and if we can get them to stop fiddling around with that for political gain, that would be great too. But each one of you has an opportunity to have that discussion, whether it's in your businesses, whether you see them in the Corrie Lounge, whether you see them in the local dairy. Your narrative, your stories your role as advocates, as individuals, not just within your associations, is so critical, and it all adds into the mix. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been my pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I possibly didn't have as many 80s references to weave through as the great Oliver Hartwich, but can I say this as a final note? There are still rules and regulations that we're working on that can only be classed as stupid and holding us back. And I invite you to add to the Business New Zealand shopping list of reform through the council, but equally as business leaders in your own right as well. If you've got good ideas, I don't mind if it's hairdressing or agrochemicals or pharmaceuticals or KiwiSaver or superannuation levels. If you think that we can add our business voice to reflect what you're concerned about and work and to continue to work to bring together that vast business choir that can be so powerful when we're aligned, we're up to do that work. Thank you.